Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to the virtual Norwich Bookstore. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name's Sam. I'm one of the co-owners of the Norwich Bookstore, and if you come here often, you may have seen me before, but if you're here for the first time, welcome. We're so glad you're joining us tonight. We are so excited for this evening's talk with Marta McDowell, an author who I know many of you admire greatly. But before we begin, I'm just going to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, of course, we are here to celebrate the release of a book tonight. It is 2 days old, just came out on Tuesday. The book is Unearthing the Secret Garden. It is the new book by Marta McDowell. You will love it. You are going to hear all about it tonight, and if you find yourself so moved to pick up a copy, I hope you'll do so from the Norwich Bookstore. I'm going to post links in the chat tonight to purchase the book from our website. I'll also post links to purchase other books by Marta McDowell, and wherever you're coming from, whether you're here in the Upper Valley or whether you are farther afield, we hope you'll order a book from us. We are happy to ship across the United States anywhere you may be, or you can have a book available for pickup in our store or out on our porch if you prefer contactless porch pickup. And either way, your book purchase is what supports our author events program. It is what keeps our bookstore running, and it is also what supports authors like Marta McDowell and allows them to keep writing and keep doing the work they do. And kind of a special treat tonight, Marta has made a very generous offer that if you are considering purchasing this book, perhaps as a gift for, I don't know, an upcoming holiday in the next few months, for a limited time, we can offer inscribed book plates. Obviously, Marta can't be here in person to sign books, though we dearly wish she could be. But if you are interested in an inscribed book plate from Marta and you order a book, you can ask us about that, and anytime before the end of October, we can send that out, send out a request to Marta and have her sign and inscribe a book plate for you. So if you are interested in some holiday gifting, or maybe you just want an inscribed book plate for yourself, that's okay too. Please don't be shy, order a copy of Unearthing the Secret Garden, and we will make sure to get you a book plate as well. And a huge thank you to Marta for offering that, a very nice service. And again, thank you, all of you, for supporting local independent bookstores. Now, we are the Norwich Bookstore. We are a independent bookstore here in the Upper Valley of Vermont. We've been here since 1994. And we do a lot of these author events, several a week sometimes during our busy season, and there's sure to be something else that you will enjoy. So we hope that you'll follow us. Check us out on social media, sign up for our newsletter on our website. It's norwichbookstore.com. And we're sure that there'll be something else that we've got coming up that you'll enjoy. So we hope to see you back here again. Now, tonight we'll do a talk and a presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we are going to have a little bit of time at the end for questions. And if you have questions for Marta McDowell, if you think of them during the talk, or if you have some saved up already, you can either put them in the chat tonight, or you can drop them in the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen. Either way, I will see your questions, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the evening. So do pop those in the Q&A box, pop them in the chat, and we'd love to see them. And thank you for your participation and your great questions always. We have a great community here of readers and of gardeners. So tonight may yield some interesting stuff. Now, without further ado, I am so delighted to welcome a Norwich Bookstore favorite, author for sure. Marta McDowell is here tonight. Again, her new book, just out on Tuesday, is Unearthing the Secret Garden. Marta McDowell lives, gardens, and writes in Chatham, New Jersey. And she consults for public gardens and for private clients. She writes and lectures on gardening topics, and she teaches landscape history and horticulture for the New York Botanical Garden, which is also where she studied landscape design. And her particular interest, as many of you know, is in authors and their gardens. And that's been explored in her best-selling books like Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life and Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life. Now she turns her attention to Frances Hodgson Burnett, author of The Secret Garden and many other popular books. And the new book is Unearthing the Secret Garden. We are so delighted that Marta is here to join us to explore the connections between the pen and the trowel tonight. From wherever you're joining us here, let's give a warm Upper Valley welcome to Marta McDowell. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Norwich, and the bookstore, and all of you for coming tonight. I thought I'd start out by showing you a few of my garden flowers. So my dahlias are in kind of their last hurrah. They always get very enthusiastic at the end of the season. And I planted extra this year because dahlias were one of the flowers that Frances talked about having in her garden that really delighted her right to the end of the growing season. And they certainly provide that for me. So I'm going to switch. I'm going to show you slides. Most of the pictures you will see are images right from the book. There are 100 illustrations shoehorned in that little book, so it's got plenty of pictures as well. And it was a lot of fun for me to write. So here's what Sam's been holding up. But here's the book that inspired me to write, the book that I am bringing out right now. It is The Secret Garden, and it is a book that was published in 1911 in book form by a writer who was already famous named Frances Hodgson Burnett. Now, if you go down the street and you ask people that you encounter if they've ever heard of her or who wrote The Secret Garden, frankly, they might not be able to tell you. She's not a household name in the way that Beatrix Potter is, or even Louisa May Alcott, let's say, but she's a very interesting person. She would be really puzzled that we think of her connected with children's books because of her, well, depending on how you count, 30, 40 books. Most of them were for adults. A few that really stuck, you never know what's going to have lasting appeal, happen to be ones that appeal to children. The Secret Garden, A Little Princess, and another one that we'll get to along the way that was actually her breakout book. Now, for me, exploring Burnett and her gardening interest really came from, who wrote this book that really was very influential to me, because I read it when I was young. I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and it really stuck with me, this idea of discovering a garden and discovering plants and their growth. So I assumed that she was a lifelong gardener. That did not turn out to be true. While she was an avid gardener at the end of her life, she really didn't start until she was around 50 years old. So here she is in the first garden that she created, with one of her big hats. Frances loved clothing, she loved fashion, and we will see a whole succession of Frances and her chapeau. This is The Secret Garden that I knew. It's had many, many different illustrators, and it continues to come out in new editions. But my Secret Garden was the one illustrated by Tasha Tudor. I was born in 1957, so this was the edition that was really popular in my day. So this is, and I'm sure most of you know the story, Mary Lennox, who has found the key. She's discovered the door, all with the help of that little robin that's shown on the top of that round illustration in the center. And so it's that story of discovery that we'll move into as we go along. So again, for me, it's like following the trail. So the hidden thing for me was, what were Burnett's gardens? Where were they? What were they like? And she had 3 fairly major gardens. The first one was in England, in the south of England, in a little village called Rolvenden, and it was an estate called Maytham Hall, which she leased for 10 years. Next, she built a home on the north shore of Long Island in the town of Manhasset, and it has a little sort of village called Plandome Park, and that's what she called her house there. Then while she lived in New York, she didn't like the winters, so she started wintering in Bermuda, where she rented another home and created another garden at a house called Clifton Heights. And so we'll get to all of these. Unfortunately, I was unable to get to Bermuda because of COVID, which made me cancel the trip. So I have yet to get there, but it's still on my list of things to do. We'll back up a little bit so that I can tell you about Frances's early life. She was born in 1849 in Manchester in the north of England. This is the youngest picture that has turned up of Frances Hodgson, but by this time she was probably already in America. But she was born to a family that was comfortably well off. Her father was a merchant. He sold iron goods. So he listed on the census ironmonger, but he actually ran a shop for fancy household goods. So think of him selling fancy plumbing supplies, fancy lighting fixtures, doorknobs, that sort of thing. And Manchester at the time, in the 1840s and 1850s, it really was a boom town in the sense of it was just making tons of money from cotton manufacturing. So this was the industrial north of England. Cotton was coming in from the American South, so the plantations, it was the output of slave labor, but it was coming to Manchester where they were milling it and printing it, and great fortunes were being made. And some of that money that was being made was drifting down into Mr. Hodgson's business. So Frances grew up in a comfortable home. It had a garden in the back that she mentions, but again, I don't think gardening started early on, not in any real sense. Before I move on, let me just say she was an avid reader. She mentions Uncle Tom's Cabin being one of her favorite books. She loved the Gothic novels, which were very popular at the time. She really liked Dickens, and she was quite imaginative. So she was really a storyteller. So to her siblings, she had 2 older brothers, 2 younger sisters. She liked to tell stories, and especially to her classmates and friends. So think of this very kind of active imagination. Her father dies when Frances is 4 years old. She remembered him, but kind of just barely. And the family suffers the consequences because the family business never does as well. Her mother tried to keep it running. And then as soon as the conflict between the American North and South starts, the cotton supply really dries up for Manchester. And it goes into what they called the Cotton Famine. And so the mills started closing. So the Hodgson family starts to move from neighborhood to neighborhood. And each time they move, they're kind of going a click down the social ladder until they end up in a neighborhood called Islington. And if you look at this old map, you can see to the left of that box and a little bit down, there's the coal wharf. And then there's also Cotton Mill, and all behind the square where there were these kind of vaguely genteel houses that had fallen on hard times that people who used to have money would rent for a lower price. There were slums, literal slums. And, you know, again, the Hodgsons were just barely hanging on. There's Frances illustrated as climbing up on her parents' secretary and pulling out the books. She was told, don't associate with those children in the neighborhood adjoining, which she more or less ignored. It wasn't that she really befriended them, but she loved talking to them because she was particularly attracted to their dialect. They didn't sound like she did. She went to a sort of finishing type school. A proper day school, and they didn't speak like her. And later on, she writes in dialect, and that comes out in The Secret Garden as well, with characters like the Sowerbees and Ben Weatherstaff. And then in later life, she remembered that somewhere around Islington Square, there was a derelict lot, a vacant lot, but it had remnants of an old wall with a very old door. This was just happened to be a picture of a door that I had. So you have to imagine a kind of old scratched up door. And when she opened it, it was just a vacant lot behind it. But she said it had been a garden once. And she goes into this long explanation of all of this elaborate garden that she imagined, complete with water features and swans. She was always very elaborate. So again, I think her imagination was already moving kind of in that direction. In 1865, her mother, Eliza Hodgson, gives up and moves the family to America, where she had a brother. And so Frances's uncle said, come over, bring the 5 children. I'll give the boys who are older, I'll give them jobs in one of my shops, and I'll find some place for you to live. His business in Knoxville, however, was in Tennessee, was really based on selling supplies to both the Union and the Confederate troops. Tennessee was a border state. And so after the Civil War ends, or when it ends, his business kind of dries up, and he doesn't have as much money as he did. So where the women of the family live is not in Knoxville. He sends them out to Newmarket, where he owned this cabin, which I think was something of a shack. Frances remembered, practically starving. The neighbors were kind and brought these kind of genteel British women who were out here in the country in Eastern Tennessee. They'd bring them food. You can see from the historical marker that they tried giving lessons and running a little school. It wasn't easy. With the boys working, they scraped together enough to move into a slightly better house, still in the same town. And it was there that Frances started to write. And she wrote both outdoors in this area in the woods that was covered with grapevines that she called her bower. Or she wrote upstairs in the unheated attic, and she called it my temple of the muses. And she's a teenager, but she decides she's going to submit a story to a magazine. And the story that she recounted is that she and her sisters picked wild grapes, and with the help of neighbors, they sold them at the market. And that is how she paid for the postage for this first story that was published in Godey's Lady's Book in 1868. Frances was 19 years old, so she publishes first under the name Fanny Hodgson. So that Fanny had been her nickname since she came to America. And that was the beginning of her career. So from age 19 until her death, she writes nonstop and supports herself and much of her family. She was always very generous with her family as well. She quickly got some reputation, and she wrote to an editor, I'm all done with Fanny. I was never called Fanny until I came to America. So Frances Hodgson from now on, if you please. I think, to be a professional woman at that time was really kind of something, She met a young boy in Newmarket named Swan Burnett. He was studying to be a doctor. They married, I think very happily at first. And They had one son a year later, and then they moved to Paris, where Swann was going to finish his training as an eye doctor. Frances at this point has one infant, and then pretty soon another one on the way. She is also supporting the family with her writing because she had a contract for the period when they were living in Paris that she had to turn out X number of stories, and that was really their living expenses. So she's also a working mother, again, at a time when that's very unusual. In 1886, so time moves along, she makes it big. So by this time, she had 12 novels published and quite a number of short stories. But 1886, she has a breakout book called Little Lord Fauntleroy. Everyone knew this title. Again, that's not as true anymore. You know, people may vaguely remember it, and they may vaguely remember a movie version of it. But at the time, this would have been the Harry Potter of its day. Everyone read this book. Mark Twain bought it for his daughter, for example. Although he did complain that he thought that she swiped the story from The Prince and the Pauper, but I don't really think that's true. I think that was, hard feelings. Here's Vivian Burnett, her younger son. The older son was Lionel, around 1862, so earlier than the book was written. And she always said that Vivian inspired the character of Little Lord Fauntleroy. He was also very precocious. He did used to call her dearest, which appears prominently in the novel. And I guess he was adorable, and she dressed him up in these little velvet suits with lace collars, and notice she also let his curls get long. This style also went large, where all mothers were dressing their little boys in velvet suits. The book comes out 1886. Fauntleroy suits start to be marketed everywhere across America, and I imagine elsewhere. And it's made sense to me when I learned this. Finally, one of my family pictures taken around 1925 shows my mother, who's the oldest, and three of her siblings with her brother dressed up in a velvet suit with lace collar and cuffs. So here's 1925. My grandmother, they barely had 2 nickels to rub together. For her son, she manages to scrape together enough for a velvet suit. So it was a style that persisted for a long time. Louisa May Alcott mentions Little Lord Fauntleroy in a letter that she writes to Mary Mapes Dodge. I knew that name, not everyone does. She wrote a book called Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates. She also edited a well-known children's magazine. And in this letter, Louisa May Alcott writes, "Yes, I am reading Lord Fauntleroy. I think it is charming. I see Mrs. Burnett as often as I can. She is rather better, but mends slowly and needs years of rest for her overworked brain. What a pity we cannot buy a new head as we do our bonnets." I found that so interesting. First of all, Louisa May Alcott at the end of her life is commenting on Frances and her book, but also that she picks up that Burnett was really overworked and in probably an exhausted state. And I imagine in some sort of depression, because it seems like Frances had these periodic Black periods where she just, she was physically ill. I think she was psychologically ill, and she just couldn't work. And then those would be followed by great bursts of productivity. So, I don't want to try to make a clinical diagnosis from across the decades, but she certainly had to deal with issues of health during her life as well. Then she had to deal with a great tragedy in her own life. By this time, Frances and Swan Burnett are really, basically separated. She started traveling a great deal. She was not only writing, but she was also dramatizing most of her novels and putting them on the stage. So she would go to Boston and New York, but also to London and to the continent to, work on the scripts and to work with the theaters. At the time, if you did not appear when your play was first performed in a country, you had no copyright protection. So some of it was necessary, but again, I think they just drifted apart. Around 1889, she learns that her older son is diagnosed with consumption. So she swoops back to Washington, D.C., where they had settled. She gathers up Lionel and she starts taking him around to various clinics and sanatoria in the Carolinas. She goes to, again, Europe, to, I think, Switzerland. Nothing helps. They end up, she takes him to Paris. She hires a private nurse. She rents an apartment. And by this time, she seems to have had a relationship with a doctor named Stephen Townsend. And he is with her and with Lionel through his final months and weeks in Paris. And it's there that Lionel dies, and she buries Lionel in Paris. So she has this great personal tragedy, this great loss. I'm sure there was guilt tied up in that as well, because she had been, pretty much an absentee mother. The boys would come visit her sometimes, but she was often away. So she travels around with her sister Edith, kind of bouncing around the continent for the following year, and eventually comes out of her grief, but a very difficult time. And I think Lionel's story also factors in later to The Secret Garden. She rented various homes in London, but she loved Portland Place, where she lived from 1893 to 1898. Portland Place is in a very fancy neighborhood, very posh neighborhood of London. It's up by Regent's Park, if you're familiar with London. And she redid Portland Place top to bottom, even though really this was just a rental. So it completely redecorates. Again, she liked to spend money. She did love to earn money. She worked hard at it, but she loved to buy clothes. Here she is in another one of her lovely outfits. She loved to redecorate. She loved to entertain, and she loved to go out. So Portland Place is the one place in London that you will see a blue plaque for Frances Hodgson Burnett. In 1898, her younger son, Vivian, graduated from Harvard. And I think that was something of a watershed for her. It was that same year that she and Swan divorce. And also that year that she decides, I've had enough of city life. I want to move to the country. It's so much cheaper to live there. Wait till you hear. And, I can work so much better if I'm in the country without distractions. So she starts looking at properties, and an agent takes her to see Maytham Hall in Kent. It had this Tudor style home. It wasn't Tudor period. I think the original house had burned and this is what was built. But it was an extensive house. You don't see the wings here. And there were 200 acres of property with all sorts of outbuildings, with gate lodges, with tenants, you name it. And this is what she rents. She became the lady of the manor. She said the agent particularly knew what I wanted because when he showed this to me, the door was open and this is what I saw. And it is a breathtaking view across what's known as the Weald of Kent. It's this rolling countryside that goes down to the English Channel, which is probably about 10 miles away as the crow flies. And so she was really taken with the property and especially the gardens. There were gardens there, walled gardens, and this big terrace garden and a very long border. Her son Vivian later wrote that his mother's pastoral period began here, that she became a passionate gardener. But what Frances said in her letters is, "This is my new fad." And she said, next year, the gardens at Maytham will be twice as lovely as they possibly could be this year. Well, how did that happen? Well, they had a gardening staff. She had a head gardener named Bolton. I do not know what his first name was, despite my best efforts on Ancestry to find out. But Bolton was directed by Frances, his new mistress, to buy plants. 3,000 of them. So again, she always had really big ideas, lots and lots of roses and perennials and other things. And we'll get back to what it looks like today a little bit later. Among its walled gardens, she found one that particularly enticed her. It was an old orchard with trees that had stopped producing. So you have to imagine these kind of craggy old trees. If you think of old apple trees where they're sort of contorted, they don't have as many leaves as they used to. They're covered with lichens. And Bolton wanted to replant them so that the orchard would be productive. But Frances saw something else entirely. She saw the chance to make a really romantic garden. Again, remember her bower in the woods in Tennessee. And so it's roses that occur to her, and we'll see how she does that as we move along. Another thing that happens is a little bird flies over the wall and starts to kind of talk to her. And it is an English robin, which are very different from our American robins. They're much smaller. I'd say they're more the size of a wren, like a house wren, or maybe a sparrow, but they're really inquisitive and also like curious birds. They will come around if you're out working in the garden. Of course, they like it if you turn over the soil, but they do just seem to hop around and almost communicate with you. And Frances really felt like she had a relationship with this robin. And in fact, her friend said when she whistled, the robin would call. And it was, they would have these conversations. The robin, of course, appears in the secret garden. And this is the garden that she puts in. So this little picture on the right-hand side is Frances in this garden that she calls My Rose Garden, even though she planted roses all over the place in her garden. This was her special garden. And you can see that she and her gardening staff have trained these climbing roses up into the old trees. And just on the left of that picture, you can barely make out, there's a wooden table and a little rustic seat. We'll see that seat as we go along. She writes, I have artfully arranged things so that instead of seeing my friends in rooms crowded with people, I see them in old gardens crowded with roses, or in an old park crowded with trees. So she always invited her friends down to Maytham Hall. And they came. This is a page out of her guest book from Maytham Hall, which is, how wonderful that this still exists. God bless librarians and archivists. This is now in the collection at Princeton University, where many of her papers are. And you can see she had a lot of friends who were artists or writers, had great fun tracking down who these people were. One of the artists sketched these guests at Maytham Hall. She would often put them to work in the garden. So people remembered, picking off rose bugs off of the plants, or, helping even with things like spreading the manure. But they did like to live it up down there. So they'd come for weekends after dinner was served, they'd move off into an area where they would smoke. Frances did smoke most of her life. They really whoop it up. She had a player piano, so they clearly liked to dance. I imagine this is kind of Tin Pan Alley kind of music, and they called themselves the Maytham Maniacs. So again, I think they really had a good old time. She liked to have fetes, have like big lawn parties for the local children and the mothers, or set up cricket matches for the village cricket team against her friends and things like that. But remember, Frances was always working. So here she is at that table with her rustic chair, and she writes, "Beautiful people lie on cushions on my lawn in the shade, but I am toiling," because she was always writing. And in the evening, she would read her friends her latest draft of whatever she was working on. Now, in 1900, I think Frances made a terrible mistake, and I think she'd agree with me now and agree with me not long after this. Stephen Townsend, that doctor that helped her with Lionel, again, back in the background, he always kind of seems to be around. He was a doctor, but he also was an aspiring actor. He seemed to sometimes act as her business manager, and evidently he had been after her to get married. And so she marries him in 1900. And what her letters say is kind of as well, I think it will settle him down when we get married. And I think she had this idea that he'd change after they married, which is never a good idea. And the tabloids picked this up. Remember, she was a divorcee. He was somewhat younger. He was 8 years younger than she was. He was not young enough to be her son. The tabloids. But it did cause a rift in the relationship between Vivian, her remaining son, and Frances. So for a year, their correspondence there's nothing. They eventually reconcile, but that was difficult as well. And within, I'm going to say, 6 weeks after the wedding, she's writing her sister saying, "I think he's insane. He was very jealous of her friends. I'm sure he wanted control of her money." And this second marriage really, I think, lasted probably a year. I mean, not much time at all. I don't know exactly when it ended. I could never find the documentation, but clearly she kept control of her own money, and she always used her first married name actually for her professional name. So much for that. So, she's using gardening really as a distraction and, as a balm. I think, again, that comes out in The Secret Garden. And she always extolled the springs in Chatham, just the wonderful springs. And in The Secret Garden, we have things like the green veil, the little green points coming out. And she writes about her garden, so that was great for me too. And there are some pictures of her that her son took. So again, by this time, they are reconciled. Again, Chatham had 200 acres of property, all that shaded in area. It had a 2-mile carriage drive through the property that went between the two gatehouses. They are still there, although they're no longer part of the same property. There was a walking path that is still there to St. Mary's, the local Church of England church. And Frances always said the vicar was a great source of information about plants and gardening. And she loved the park and its trees. But in 1908, 10 years after she took the lease, Chatham Hall was sold. And you think, why didn't she buy it? She said, "This is the only place I ever felt like real home." But Vivian, her son, was working in New York City. He wanted his mother to come back to America and build a house somewhere close to him where he could come for the weekends. So that's what she does instead. But it is in that period between Chatham Hall, which she feels deeply the loss, and this new house that she writes The Secret Garden. And it comes out in serial form in 1910. She sets it in Yorkshire, not in Kent, but there are many similarities, including a gardener that this little orphan girl meets, Ben Weatherstaff, She's orphaned in India. She's sent to her uncle, who's a widower, on his estate, Misselthwaite Manor in Yorkshire. He travels a lot. She's left with the staff. She does befriend a robin who's shown in the bottom left-hand corner of this image, and she sort of befriends old Ben Weatherstaff as well. Again, she finds this door, she goes in, and there are wonderful passages describing, entering into this new world that she discovers. And is it dead? Can she bring it back to life? Because it's a garden that's been closed up for 10 years. And it's forbidden. She's not supposed to be in there. And so it's her own special place. There are similarities to the rose garden at Maytham Hall. So Maytham Hall had a sundial. The Secret Garden has a sundial. The Secret Garden has roses. Her rose garden at Maytham had roses, obviously. There is a character named Dickinson, who's a sort of magic boy. He's the brother of her maid, Martha Sowerby, so he's a local boy. He understands animals. He charms the animals. He's like, Pan or some kind of Greek god or fairy. And he also knows everything about gardening. So he becomes her garden mentor. She lets him in on the secret. She asks her uncle, who returns from a trip, may I have a bit of earth to work. It's kind of sly, right? Because she knows she's not supposed to be in this garden that her uncle closed up, but he says, yes, if you see a bit of earth, take it. And she takes that as carte blanche. She can go ahead and do what she wants. On rainy days, she does other things. And I found this passage. I'm just going to share this with you. There's a scene where she finds little ivory elephants in a room that she's not supposed to be in. But, she's a bored little girl. And I found this in Frances's letters that she had been in Switzerland visiting a town called Montreux. And during the day, she'd walk around, and every day she'd pass this shop that was selling little ivory elephants. And she writes to her sister, I have 8 now. If I buy them one at a time, I shall not feel the shock. So they must have been expensive. I want a herd. So she puts that in the secret garden. And Mary Lennox discovers, much to her surprise, that she has a cousin who is an invalid little boy about her age named Colin. She had heard these cries in the night, so it has a little bit of that Jane Eyre quality. And in fact, one of Frances's friends wrote, this is a children's Jane Eyre. So, it's true if you've thought that. She also Frances wrote her friend Ella Dixon, the book, The Secret Garden, was our rose garden as it would have been if it had been locked up for years and years and years, and some hungry children had found it. So I loved it when I found that passage. Plandome Park, she moves in 1909, and she calls it Plandome Park, but I found this piece of stationery dated 1909, where she clearly had considered calling this house Maytham, which she didn't do ultimately, but I thought that was interesting. It was a beautiful property. It was a very comfortable house. It wasn't a huge, kind of Vanderbilt type house, but very lovely and comfortable. It was on 3 acres, right on the waterfront on Manhasset Bay. And she said it's on a pretty bay on Long Island, which makes it look much larger than it is. It looked larger than 3 acres, which is still a big garden. And you can see some of the gardens that she puts in. So lots of roses, lots of shrubs, and lots of flowers. Again, more and more roses as time goes on. She always bought plants. She was a great plant buyer. She loved the catalogs. She loved delphinium. And she called her garden my land of the blue flowers, because one year it looked like this, and it was, full of delphinium. And her son said they were her greatest triumph and her greatest tragedy, because after that one year, she could never get them to look this good again. It happens. Here's her desk at Plandome Park. She is looking out at these pictures of Maytham Hall as she's sitting at her desk. And you see the cut flowers there too. Always loved cut flowers. So still working. Again, she works her whole life, keeps writing. In the winters, she'd go to Bermuda, which she said was like heaven. And she rents this house and again, starts to plant up, learns a whole new set of plants, things like hibiscus and crotons and alcalipha, and orders lots of plants for Clifton Heights. Love the birds. Again, she always talks about birds in her letters. She had a particular affinity for them. It was fun for me when I saw this quote where she says, oh, where is it? I foresee that one is going to make a comfortable income by film rights. Again, she was always looking for ways to monetize it. This is a later version of The Secret Garden, but there were earlier ones as well. I still like this version of the movie. But mostly she was in Plandome Park for the majority of the year, and that's where she gardened, entertained lots of friends, continued to work, gave charity events, sold flowers for the women's suffrage movement. She did a whole variety of things, but kept working. It's a very nice story because Vivian, her son, married and built a house next door. And he and his wife had 2 little girls. So Frances also had grandchildren to enjoy the garden. She dies at Plandome in 1924. She was in her 70s. She was still writing on her deathbed. What she was writing were articles about gardening, which her son collected and published the year after her death, called In the Garden. And it's very hard to find. So I rekeyed it and it's in the back of my book because it'd be nice to have. She's buried in Roslyn Cemetery in her family. You know, she created a family plot and she had a statue of Lionel put there. Remember, he's still in Paris. There is a fountain in Central Park in New York City that her friends, you know, got contributions together and had put in Central Park. It's in the Conservatory Garden and it's a scene from The Secret Garden, even though she wrote 30 plus other books. And here's what Maytham Hall looks like today. It was greatly redone after her period by an architect named Edwin Lutyens for the new owners. He did change the garden somewhat, but it's still there, pretty much intact in terms of the old walls. And it's still gardened quite actively by a horticulture staff, although the house is split now into, I think, what we'd call condominiums, very fancy condominiums. And so The Secret Garden, you know, really this was my quest to come upon, you know, what was its story and what was the story of its author. So with that, I'll stop talking and take some questions. So let me get out of the share. And we'll get Sam back and see if any of you have questions about The Secret Garden or anything else.
Yes, thank you, Marta. And if you do have questions, you drop them in the chat or into the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen. It just says Q&A. You can type your question in there and we will be happy to answer questions you may have. I don't know about anyone else who might be here, but I learned a ton just now about Frances and her life. I had no idea about all of this, and so I'm quite fascinated and really would love to know more. You had mentioned that you weren't able to get to Bermuda, Marta, in the course of your research. Evelyn in the Q&A wants to know, did you visit the other houses, the other 2 houses, and can you tell us anything about them?
Sure. So I went out to Manhasset. I had the address of her home, Plandome Park, and you know, courtesy of the amazing, you know, Google Maps, we drove to the location. It's still a beautiful piece of property, but the house is completely gone, and a new house was actually under construction at the point that I visited. I knew that the house had been taken down because it had a fire after her death. Actually, her nephew was living there at the time. and there was some sort of an electrical fire. So the house burned, but the garage was supposed to still be there, and it was the garage that had the greenhouse attached. And it was quite a fancy garage with brick, but that also was gone. So there really is nothing left of the house in Manhasset except of the property itself. And really nothing of the garden. Clifton Heights, because of COVID, I was unable to take that trip, much to my disappointment. The house is definitely still there. From what I could tell from Google Image, it looks like there aren't gardens there. There's a swimming pool, and it looks like, very rudimentary landscaping. Not a garden. Again, the gardens that she had were very elaborate. They were plant heavy. Those tend not to persist, unfortunately. Trees persist, but perennials and flowering shrubs, not so much, unless there's someone actively gardening it. So really the only one that has any semblance of similarity to what she knew is Maytham Hall, now called Great Maytham Hall. And you can visit, but you have to go on one of the open days because it is a private property. So, if you want to visit, you can check. It's called the National Gardening Scheme in England.
Sally in the chat wants to know, were you able to track down any living descendants of Frances Hodgson Burnett?
Yes, in fact, I think it's her great-great-granddaughter wrote an afterword for my book, which was really fun. So I met her, she's very enthusiastic. I imagine she has something of her great-great-grandmother's personality because, she's very, very enthusiastic about life.
And a great question in the Q&A, one that I had as well. So you talk about how Frances would probably be surprised to know that The Secret Garden is what she's best remembered for. What else should we read, especially her adult books? Do you have a favorite book of hers?
I would definitely suggest her first novel, which is called That Lass O'Lowrie's. It is a novel set in England. It is about the daughter of a miner who, kind of raises up. Her novels, I will say, are quite sentimental, compared to what I typically read today. But, I think of the period, it's a really interesting novel, and it employs that dialect and also that north of England setting. So that one I like a lot. Another one that you might try that she wrote around the period of Maytham Hall is called The Shuttle. It has really nothing to do with weaving. It has to do with shuttling back and forth on steamships, which Frances did quite a bit. We think of nowadays, we travel a lot because we fly back and forth, but she traveled a great deal, and she was going by these steam liners where you would have a cabin and it would take, it would take a few days, but it was really pretty quick. And that's what the book is about.
Yeah, I was really surprised and fascinated in hearing your talk by how kind of modern her life was in terms of the travel and the number of places that she called home. Great question from Evelyn. You've written about several different literary figures. How do you determine who you're going to write about?
It's usually serendipity, I will say. It's, I bump into someone like Emily Dickinson. I had no idea she was a gardener. I went to the museum in Amherst, Massachusetts. And when I learned that, I went, not to mix my literary metaphors, but I kind of went down a rabbit hole. And that emerged. Beatrix Potter, I saw 2 books. I saw a book of her collected stories and a biography, a big biography by Linda Lear. And that was like, oh, look, she gardened. Imagine when I pick up a biography, I turn to the index and look up garden, because that's what interests me. So sometimes, like this book with Frances Hodgson Burnett, it's just that it was a book that was so extremely meaningful to me that I wanted to write this book. And it was a strange book in that it kind of wrote itself. I did a lot of research, which meant sitting in archives and reading, folders and folders and folders of letters, but always the right thing turned up. So that was a great experience. So usually I like some little personal connection that leverages my interest, because it takes a lot of time. So you really want to be interested.
Absolutely. We have a question about influences for Frances Hodgson Burnett. Jennifer wants to know, do you know if she was influenced by Gertrude Jekyll or any other famous British landscape designers? And do you know if she ever visited Sissinghurst?
As far as I know, no, I don't think she ever visited Sissinghurst. So I don't think she knew Vita Sackville West. I didn't find any indication that she was aware of Gertrude Jekyll or William Robinson. So those are like the 2 big names. Although the rose garden that she creates at Matham is very much in that arts and crafts garden kind of period and feeling. She does talk about books about roses, particularly he was an Anglican, in the Anglican hierarchy, his name was Dean Reynolds Hole, Hole, and Dean Hole is like a famous name in the Rosarian world. In fact, I think he started the English Rose Society. So she talked about him. She had other gardening books. She talked to a lot of neighbors, people in her social strata. And then, of course, she always had some professional help as well, but she learned as she went along. There's a lot in the little book called In the Garden, where she talks about, how she learned about gardening, and that you don't have to be really knowledgeable or rich to start a garden.
Great, thank you. Marta, if you can tell us, do you have any idea what you're going to be working on next?
Thank you for asking an author's favorite question. Yes, I'm hard at work on a new book. I think of this as my COVID project, because archives were not really available in the same way for research. So I started to write a book based on an article I'd written a long time ago about garden themes in murder mysteries. So that's what I'm working on, with a working title, although I will tell you they never use my titles, but I'm calling it Gardening Can Be Murder. So I hope that it works out. I hope you enjoy it. I've certainly enjoyed reading many, many more mysteries, much more crime fiction. And
oh, that's fantastic. Timber Press, if anyone's listening, keep that title. You gotta. Oh, that's great. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Marta McDowell, and thank you to all of you out there for your great questions. This was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I always enjoy, I go to all of these, and I always enjoy the ones where I really learn something. So thank you so much for spending a time with us tonight. The new book, of course, is Unearthing the Secret Garden. It is the brand new book from Marta McDowell. It is available at the Norwich bookstore. We just got a big shipment of them in today. And if you are here in the Upper Valley, you can stop by and pick a copy up, or if you prefer not to come into the store, order one or call us. You can order online or give us a shout, and we will put one out on the porch for you for contactless pickup. And of course, if you are from further afield, we're happy to ship you a copy via USPS Media Mail or a carrier of your choice. You just let us know and we'd be delighted to do it. And again, Marta would be happy to sign and inscribe book plates for you. Through the end of October, we can make that happen. So if you would like that, put it in the order comments or let us know, and we would be happy to make that work for you. And of course, order early this year, please. Shipping is going to be a challenge. So if this is a perfect gift for someone on your list, and I can think of a couple of people on mine that it absolutely is, pick it up now, because it is going to be a season where we have to plan in advance. So thank you. And Marta McDowell, thank you so much for spending your Thursday night with us. It has been an honor and a pleasure to have you here. And I hope that for that next book, we can have you here in person.
Me too. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Norwich.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening wherever you're calling in from. We hope you're doing good work, reading good books, and being safe. We'll see you next time.
Happy gardening.